never wrote this down when the war ended. We were ordered not to. In 1945, as the front collapsed and the forests burned, our unit learned the difference between enemy fire and something far older. The reports list that night as a routine withdrawal through scorched woodland. What they don't record are the shadows that moved against the flames, or the silence that fell when even the insects stopped screaming. We were trained to recognize ambushes, not omens. But something walked those burning trees with purpose. Something that did not retreat. I survived because it let me. For 80 years I've carried that certainty like shrapnel. Now, before the memory burns away completely, I'll tell you what came out of the fire. Welcome to Combat Lore Files, where the shadows of war live on. Hit subscribe and get nightly drops of stories like this. They told us the forest was already dead, burned clean by artillery and abandoned by everything living. That was the first lie we believed. By the spring of 1945, I had stopped counting days and started counting withdrawals. Time no longer moved forward. It peeled backward, kilometer by kilometer, village by village, as the front collapsed behind us like rotten scaffolding. My name isn't important. What matters is that I was infantry, 24 years old, carrying a rifle whose wood stock was cracked from recoil and cold, marching with a unit that had been rebuilt too many times to remember its original number. We were no longer fighting for victory. We were fighting to move, to breathe, to not be the last men left standing when the map lines finally erased us. That evening the orders came folded in oil-stained paper, passed down from a lieutenant who looked older than my father despite being 10 years younger. Withdraw through the southern forest, he said, voice flat, eyes avoiding ours. Enemy armor reported north. No engagement unless necessary. Burn anything useful behind you. No questions. We didn't ask them anymore. The forest loomed ahead of us like a wall of smoke and flame. Artillery had passed through days earlier, setting the trees alight to deny cover, turning the ground into a maze of embers and blackened trunks. The sky above glowed a sick orange, as if the sun itself had caught fire and was bleeding into the clouds as we marched. Our boots sank into warm ash that puffed up around our ankles, coating our trousers, sticking to sweat-soaked skin. Every step smelled of resin, wet soil, and something sharper. Burned meat. Though none of us said it aloud, the radio on my back hissed with static, broken only by fragments of distant commands and the occasional scream of feedback when the antenna brushed a branch. Morale was gone. Discipline was all that remained. We moved because stopping meant dying, and dying meant being left behind, nameless and uncounted. The men around me didn't speak much anymore. When they did, it was in short, functional bursts, ammo counts, direction checks, curses muttered under breath. Somewhere to our left, something exploded with a deep, hollow boom, and a shockwave rolled through the forest, rattling branches and sending a rain of sparks drifting down like fireflies. One of the newer boys flinched and crossed himself. Though he pretended he was wiping sweat from his brow, the forest wasn't silent. Not it crackled and popped as burning trees split and collapsed, sending showers of embers skittering across the ground. There was the constant low roar of distant fire, like the breathing of a giant asleep beneath the earth, and beneath it all something else. A pressure I felt more than heard, a tightening in the chest, as if the air itself was watching us. We passed the first abandoned village just before dusk. That half-burned houses sagged into themselves, roofs collapsed, walls blackened by smoke. In the center stood a well, its stone rim cracked, a bucket still hanging from a frayed rope, frozen in the act of being pulled up. There were no bodies. That unsettled me more than if there had been corpses. Life had left in a hurry. On one door, scratched deep into the wood, were symbols I didn't recognize. Not letters, not words, but marks that curved and twisted like branches or claws. One of the men spat and said it was peasant superstition, charms against fire or spirits. No one laughed. An old woman appeared at the edge of the village as we were passing through. She must have been hiding in one of the cellars, wrapped in layers of cloth, her face lined and gray with ash. She didn't beg. She didn't shout. She just stared at us with eyes so wide and pale they seemed to reflect the flames behind us. When our lieutenant ordered her away, she said something in her language, fast and urgent, pointing toward the forest. Her voice shook, not with fear of us, but with something else, reverence, maybe, or warning. I caught only one word repeated again and again, a sound like tenebris or tenebra, something about darkness. The lieutenant pushed her aside and ordered us forward. They all say nonsense like that. he muttered. War makes animals out of people, but as we marched on, I noticed none of the locals had fled toward the forest. They had all gone the long way around, even if it meant crossing open fields under artillery fire. The forest thickened as night crept in. Charred trunks rose like black pillars, their branches reaching overhead, interlocking and blocking out the dying light. Fog rolled in low along the ground, mixing with smoke until the world shrank to a narrow tunnel of visibility. The flames were everywhere and nowhere at once, sometimes leaping suddenly from a fallen log, sometimes absent for long stretches, leaving us in near darkness lit only by the dull red glow of embers. Our columns stretched thin, men disappearing into haze ahead of me, reappearing as silhouettes when the fire flared. One by one, we switched to hand signals, conserving our voices, as if sound itself might give us away. That I remember thinking how wrong that was. Enemy patrols announced themselves with engines and shouting. What we feared now had no need for noise. The first strange thing happened when the wind changed. The flames, which had been moving steadily east, suddenly bent inward, leaning toward us as if drawn by our passage. Fire doesn't do that. Not without reason. One of the corporals swore and checked his compass, tapping it when the needle spun, then froze, eyes narrowing. That's not right, he said quietly. The compass settled, then drifted again, never quite pointing north. We moved on anyway, because orders don't stop for unease. My sweat turned cold on my back as the temperature dropped sharply, an impossible chill cutting through the heat of the fires. My breath fogged in front of my face, mixing with smoke until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Somewhere ahead, a tree collapsed with a thunderous crack, sending sparks into the air, but beneath that sound, I thought I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, too heavy to be one of ours and too spaced out to be running. I stopped. Listening, the man behind me bumped into my pack and cursed under his breath. Keep moving, he whispered. I did, but the feeling stayed, crawling up my spine like an insect. Ahead, the point man raised a fist, signaling halt. We froze, boots sinking slightly into the warm ground. The forest had gone quiet, not the gentle quiet of night, but a sudden, unnatural absence of sound. No crackling flames, no wind, no distant artillery. Just our breathing and the faint creak of leather straps under tension. My ears rang in the silence, as if something had pressed down on the world and squeezed everything else out. Then I saw it. Not clearly, not fully, but enough. A shape stood between two burning trunks ahead, darker than the darkness around it. A vertical smear against the firelight. It didn't move when the flames shifted. It didn't flicker or dance like smoke. It stood there, tall and narrow, its edges blurred as if the air itself bent around it. I blinked, convinced it was exhaustion, smoke in my eyes. But when I opened them again, the shape was still there, and I felt, with a certainty that made my stomach drop, that it was looking back at us. No order came. No command broke the silence. The lieutenant stared forward, jaw clenched, his hand hovering near his pistol but not drawing it. Whatever training we had left did not cover this. We were soldiers at the edge of a dying war, standing in a burning forest that refused to behave like a forest should. We believed the forest was empty, until the fire revealed what had been hiding inside it. Fire is honest. It follows the wind. It consumes what it can. That night, it began to choose. After the shape revealed itself and then slipped back into the glare, the lieutenant ordered us forward as if movement alone could erase what we'd seen. No one argued. We resumed the march, boots crunching through cinders, but the rhythm was gone. Every man walked with his head tilted slightly upward now, eyes scanning trunks and branches instead of the ground, fingers tight around rifle grips slick with sweat. Night fell quickly, faster than it should have. The last strip of sky ceiling shut above. The canopy like a wound clotted over. The fires became our only light. And that was when their behavior changed. At first it was subtle. Flames leaned sideways, stretching toward us in long tongues even when the wind cut the opposite direction. Sparks lifted and drifted not with the air currents but in slow, spiraling arcs, as if following paths already decided. Some trees burned hot and fast, erupting with sharp cracks that echoed like rifle shots. Others stood untouched, bark dark but intact, leaves green and damp looking despite the heat. These living islands formed corridors through the fire, narrow passages that funneled us forward whether we liked it or not. I could feel the temperature shift with every step. Searing heat one moment, then a cold pocket that raised gooseflesh beneath my jacket. The radio hissed louder, static thickening until voices vanished entirely. I smacked the casing, adjusted the antenna, even switched frequencies. But nothing came through except a low hum that vibrated against my spine like distant chanting. Some of the men noticed it too. They glanced at my pack, then away, unwilling to ask what they already sensed. The forest floor changed beneath us. Ash gave way to exposed soil, dark and wet, stamped with old impressions that hadn't yet been burned away. Boot prints, wagon ruts, barefoot tracks heading in every direction except deeper into the trees. "Looks like they ran," someone whispered. "Everyone ran," another replied. "Except us." The path narrowed, trunks closing in, and I began to feel boxed, shepherded along a route I hadn't chosen ahead. A sudden flare of light erupted as a standing pine ignited all at once, flame racing up its trunk in a vertical roar. The heat slammed into us, forcing men to stagger back, arms raised instinctively to shield faces. That was when I saw movement again. This time closer point, two shapes stood just beyond the burning tree, outlined briefly in orange. They were tall. Taller than any man I knew, and, perfectly still, they did not recoil from the heat. When the tree collapsed with a thunderous crack, sending embers scattering, the shapes were gone. "Contact?" Someone hissed, and no answer. The lieutenant motioned us into a defensive half-circle, rifles raised, muzzles cutting through smoke. No shots were fired. There was nothing solid to aim at, nothing our eyes could lock onto long enough to justify pulling a trigger. "It's smoke," the sergeant muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "Your eyes are lying to you. Maybe, but smoke doesn't stand upright. Smoke doesn't keep its distance." As we pressed on, reports filtered back through the column in murmurs. One man swore he'd seen a figure pacing us parallel to the trail, always just beyond the firelight. Another claimed something had crossed the path ahead without making a sound, leaving the flames briefly guttering in its wake. A corporal laughed too loudly and said we were all losing our minds, that exhaustion did this, that men had seen angels and devils in worse conditions. He stopped laughing when we found the first rifle lying in the dirt. It belonged to a private who'd been walking 2 positions ahead of me. Not dropped, not broken. Placed neatly against a tree trunk, sling folded, metal still warm as if recently held. We called his name, and no answer, no tracks leading away. No blood, no sign of struggle. Just absence. Command's response came down the line quickly and coldly. Maintain formation. Do not break ranks. Assume desertion or injury. They said. Nothing about retrieval. The war had taught us what that silence meant. The fires intensified as the night deepened. But not uniformly. In some sections the blaze raged so fiercely we were forced to detour, crawling through smoke so thick it burned the eyes and throat. In others, the flames shrank away from the path, retreating as we approached, leaving the ground strangely bare, as if swept clean. My boots left clear impressions there, crisp and dark against pale soil, each step distinct. I remember thinking how exposed we were, how easy targets would be to spot in that unnatural clearing. But no shots came. Instead, the silence pressed harder, stretching between the crackles and pops until every sound felt amplified. The rasp of breath through a scarf, the click of a safety being disengaged, the soft clink of dog tags hastily tucked beneath shirts. We halted again when the point man raised his fist, arm trembling. This time there was no doubt. Ahead of us, between 3 unburned trees, stood something that did not belong. It was not fully visible, not solid the way a man is, but it occupied space, bending the light around it. The firelight slid off its surface, failing to illuminate details, leaving only a darker silhouette within darkness. It was broad at the shoulders, narrowing as it descended, its outline too smooth, too deliberate to be chanced. My heart hammered so hard I feared it would give me away. "Fire?" someone whispered, barely audible. The lieutenant didn't give the order. Stared forward, eyes wide, lips moving as if counting or praying. The shape did not advance. It simply remained. And in that stillness I felt judged, measured, weighed. When a gust of wind finally cut through the trees, the flames surged and the silhouette fractured, dissolving into smoke and shadow. The moment passed, but the damage was done and no one spoke afterward. We moved like ghosts, every nerve raw, waiting for the forest to react to us again. As the hours dragged on, more men disappeared, always. At the edges, always without sound. Once, I thought I felt a hand brush my pack, fingers cold through the canvas. But when I spun around, there was nothing behind me except drifting ash and the vague impression of depth. As if the trees had stepped back to make room, somewhere near midnight, the sergeant ordered a short halt to regroup. We counted heads silently. The number was wrong. No one needed to say it. We were losing men without fighting. And no one could explain how. A junior officer insisted. Again that it was fatigue, that the mind fills gaps when the body fails. He quoted manuals, training lectures, anything to anchor himself in familiar ground. But his hands shook as he spoke, and his eyes kept darting toward the unburned trees, where the darkness seemed thicker, heavier, as if layered. One of the older veterans knelt and examined the ground, running his fingers along the soil. He called me over and pointed. There, perfectly imprinted, were footprints. Large ones, longer than a boot, pressed deep into the earth. They moved alongside our trail for several meters, then stopped abruptly, toes digging in as if bracing against forward motion. There were no marks beyond that point, no scuffs, no leap impressions, no disturbance at all. It was as if whatever made them had simply ceased to exist where it stood. I straightened slowly, a chill settling into my bones that had nothing to do with the cold. We had blamed exhaustion. Smoke? Fear? Exhaustion doesn't explain footprints. We didn't linger over the footprints. The sergeant ordered us moving again, his voice sharp, brittle, stretched thin by the effort of sounding in control. No one argued. The forest had taught us that stopping was an invitation. As we marched, the ground slowly hardened, ash giving way to packed earth and stones, and with it came a different smell, damp rot, moss, old water trapped beneath roots that fire hadn't reached. The flames thinned here, retreating to the edges, leaving us inside a corridor of shadow where the darkness felt layered, as if several nights overlapped in the same place. My shoulders ached from the weight of my pack, but I barely felt it. All my attention was fixed outward, straining to catch movement that might explain what had taken those men. We passed another cluster of abandoned buildings, smaller than the first village, little more than farm sheds, and a low wooden structure half sunk into the ground. I recognized it instantly as a shrine of some kind, the sort locals built generations ago and never fully abandoned. It was scorched on one side, but the symbols carved into its beams were untouched. Deep grooves filled with soot but not burned away. A bundle of sticks and bones hung from the doorway, swaying gently though there was no wind. "Don't touch anything," the lieutenant snapped, though no one had moved to do so. One of the older soldiers, Klaus, a man who had been fighting since before I'd grown facial hair, stared at the carvings longer than the rest of us. "I've seen marks like this," he muttered, almost to himself. "Not here in the east. A forest near the border." I asked him what they meant. He shook his head slowly. "Depends who you ask. Some say it's a warning. Some say it's a door." That was the first time anyone suggested the forest wasn't just a place we were passing through, but something with rules of its own. We resumed marching, but the air felt heavier now, thick with the sense that we'd crossed some boundary we didn't understand. The radio crackled briefly, spitting out fragments of words and languages I couldn't place, overlapping voices bleeding into one another before collapsing back into static. I shut it off entirely, unable to stand the noise. The silence that followed was worse. Without the hiss, every sound stood naked and sharp. The snap of twigs, the scrape of fabric, the slow, deliberate thud of my own heartbeat in my ears. Somewhere off to our right, a tree creaked under its own weight and fell, but the sound was wrong. It didn't crash or splinter. It was more like a sigh, long and low, followed by nothing. One of the men whispered that he smelled water. We were nowhere near a river, but once he said it, I noticed it too. A cold, mineral scent cutting through smoke and ash, as if something ancient and wet lay buried beneath the roots. The forest floor sloped downward, and mist pooled around our boots, rising higher with every step until it brushed against our knees. The flames refused to follow us into this hollow, clinging instead to the higher ground, leaving us moving through a bowl of fog lit only by distant firelight. That was when the stories started. Not shouted, not even spoken aloud, but passed in murmurs between men walking side by side. A private claimed his grandmother used to warn him about forests that burned without being destroyed, places where fire woke things instead of killing them. Another man said the locals back home believed shadows were living things, that they fed on chaos and blood and grew stronger when the land was scarred by violence. No one laughed this time. The war had stripped us of the luxury of disbelief. Klaus fell in beside me again, his rifle slung low. "They used to say," he whispered, "that when Too many men die in one place. The ground remembers that IT starts answering questions no one asked. I asked him what questions, he didn't reply, just kept his eyes forward, jaw tight as if summoned by the words. The mist ahead thickened, swirling unnaturally, coiling around the trunks in slow, deliberate motions that I saw shapes forming within it. Suggestions of limbs, angles that straightened and bent, then dissolved before I could be sure of what I'd seen. The lieutenant ordered a tighter formation, but the forest resisted, trunks crowding closer, roots snaking up from the ground to trip and snag. Our progress slowed to a crawl, every step measured, every breath cautious. Then someone screamed that IT was short and sharp, cut off almost immediately, coming from somewhere behind us. The column twisted as men turned, rifles swinging wildly, muzzles slicing through fog that we backtracked a few steps and found nothing. No body, no blood, no sign that anyone had been there at all, but the count was wrong again. One more missing. Command's patience snapped. The lieutenant barked orders into the void, demanding answers from men who could only shake their heads. He blamed nerves, blamed cowardice, blamed the creeping madness of retreat. He threatened punishment for anyone spreading panic, his voice cracking with strain. But even as he spoke, the mist parted ahead of us, revealing a small clearing that made my stomach drop. The ground there was bare and smooth, free of ash and debris, as if scrubbed clean. In the center stood a single tree, tall and unburned, its bark pale and unmarked despite the devastation around it. Its base lay objects arranged carefully in a circle, helmets, packs, rifles, boots. All ours. All belonging to men who had been walking with us less than an hour earlier. No bodies. Just equipment, placed with an intention that felt unmistakable. No animal scavenged like that. No enemy patrol would risk exposure for trophies. Command ordered us not to approach, but the damage was done. Some of the younger soldiers were crying openly now, tears cutting clean lines through Sudan. Their faces. One dropped to his knees and retched, hands shaking so violently his rifle clattered against the ground I couldn't look away from the tree. The longer I stared, the more wrong it felt, like a landmark that didn't belong to the world we knew. I had the overwhelming urge to step closer, to touch the bark, to confirm it was real. That urge terrified me more than anything else that night. Klaus grabbed my sleeve, his grip iron tight. "Don't," he hissed. "That's how it starts." Before I could ask what he meant, the fire surged suddenly at the edge of the clearing, flames leaping high, cutting off our line of retreat. The heat slammed into us, forcing us forward, toward the tree, toward the circle of abandoned gear. The lieutenant shouted for us to push through, to break out of the hollow before we were boxed in. But as we advanced, the mist thickened again, swallowing the clearing, erasing the tree from view as if it had never existed. When the fog thinned moments later, the clearing was empty. No tree, no equipment. Just scorched earth and drifting ash, indistinguishable from everything else around you. As No one spoke after that. There was nothing left to say. The forest had shown us it could rearrange itself at will, that it could present truths and then erase them without effort. We were no longer marching through a retreat route. We were moving through a place that remembered older rules, older stories. Rules the war had trampled over without understanding. As we pushed on, numb and hollow, I realized the fear clawing at my chest wasn't just about dying. It was about being absorbed, erased, turned into another whisper the forest would carry long after the war forgot our names. And somewhere ahead, beyond the fire and fog, I felt with sickening certainty that whatever was watching us was no longer content to remain unseen. The moment you realize something is watching you is not the moment you panic. It's the moment you understand panic won't help. By the time we left the hollow behind, the unit no longer moved like soldiers, we moved like prey. Hunched shoulders, shortened strides, heads turning too often and never enough, the forest pressed closer. The trunks no longer random but aligned in ways that forced us into narrow lanes. Our formation stretched and compressed against our will. The fires stayed with us now, never fully retreating, never fully surrounding us, flaring just enough to keep our silhouettes visible against the dark. I could feel heat on my face and cold at my back at the same time, a contradiction that made my skin crawl. The lieutenant kept whispering into the radio, even though it no longer responded, as if saying the words out loud might summon authority back into existence. We advanced another 100 meters when the man directly ahead of me slowed, then stopped. I nearly collided with him before I saw why. The ground in front of us dipped sharply, forming a shallow ravine choked with smoke and shadow. The flames refused to cross it, licking the edges but never descending, as if something down there repelled them. On the far side, between two trees, stood a figure. This time there was no mistaking it. It was taller than a man by a full head. Its proportions wrong, elongated, its outline sharp enough to separate from the darkness behind it. It did not sway or shift its weight. It did not breathe. The firelight slid across it without revealing surface or detail, like light striking oil-black glass. My mouth went dry. I could hear my own pulse, slow and heavy, pounding in my ears. Someone behind me whimpered. The lieutenant raised his pistol halfway, arm trembling, then froze. The figure tilted. Not its head, not exactly, but something about it changed orientation, as if it were adjusting its attention. That was when the forest reacted. The flames surged violently, not outward, but inward, curling toward the ravine, drawn as if by gravity. The heat intensified, forcing us back a step, boots scraping against rock. The figure did not retreat. It remained where it was, unbothered, and I understood with sudden clarity that the fire was not threatening it. The fire was obeying it. One of the men fired. A single shot cracked the air, deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet vanished into the darkness near the figure with no visible effect. Eno recoiled, Eno flinched, Eno response at all. The shot echoed once, then was swallowed by the forest, leaving behind a silence thicker than before. That was the moment discipline finally broke. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in fragments. Some men shouted, some backed away blindly. Others stood frozen, rifles shaking, unable to choose between running and shooting. The lieutenant screamed for order, for ceasefire, for formation. But his voice sounded small, distant, stripped of authority. The figure moved. It did not walk. It did not lunge. It advanced by existing closer than it had before, crossing distance without motion. The space between us and it simply collapsed. The ravine seemed to flatten, the ground rising under our feet, forcing us into proximity I hadn't chosen. My lungs seized, refusing to draw breath, as if the air had thickened into something almost solid. I smelled iron, sharp and fresh, like blood spilled moments ago, though no one had been hit. The nearest man dropped his rifle and clawed at his throat, eyes bulging, mouth opening and closing without sound. He fell to his knees, then tipped forward and lay still. No wound, no mark. Just gone. I fired then. Not at the figure, but beside it, into the darkness, desperate to create space, to break whatever pressure held us there. The muzzle flash lit the clearing for a split second, and in that instant I saw more than one. There were shapes everywhere, standing just beyond the reach of the flames, arranged in a loose arc around us. They varied in height and width, but all shared the same wrongness, the same refusal to be fully seen. They were not soldiers. They were not animals. They were witnesses. The lieutenant finally broke. He turned and ran, shouting for us to follow, pushing through a gap between burning trunks. The forest resisted immediately. Branches snagged uniforms. Roots rose where there had been none, catching boots, sending men sprawling. The shapes did not pursue in the way enemies do. They did not rush. They did not need to. We ran because the forest allowed it, because the fire parted just enough to let us pass. One man stumbled and didn't get up. I looked back once, only once, and saw his pack lift from the ground as if pulled by invisible hands, sliding smoothly into the darkness. No struggle, no sound. We didn't stop to help. We couldn't. By the time we burst into a wider section of forest, panting and disordered, nearly a third of the unit was gone. The lieutenant collapsed to his knees, retching, his pistol forgotten in the dirt. The sergeant took over without a word, barking short, brutal commands that snapped some measure of function back into us. We moved again. Because standing still felt like surrender. The forest grew denser, the fires thinning but never disappearing, their glow flickering at the edges of vision like watching eyes. The shapes did not reappear openly, but their presence remained undeniable. I felt it in the way my shadow stretched wrong across the ground, pulling away from me at odd angles. I felt it in the way the radio, still powered off, vibrated softly against my back, humming in a rhythm that did not belong to machinery. One by one, men began to lag, exhaustion overtaking terror. When they fell behind, the forest seemed to close around them, trunks shifting subtly, paths narrowing. I stayed close to Klaus, matching his pace, refusing to let distance open between us. He muttered under his breath constantly now, fragments of prayers, old sayings, half-remembered warnings from places far from here. "They don't like fire," he said once. "But they need it." I asked him what he meant. He shook his head. "Fire wakes them, that it feeds them, that it tells them where to look." We reached a ridge just before dawn, the sky lightening slightly beyond the trees. The sergeant ordered a brief halt to count heads and assess. The number was devastating. We had lost nearly half the unit in a single night, without a single confirmed enemy contact, without a single body to report. The lieutenant sat apart, staring at his hands as if he no longer recognized them. Command, wherever it still existed, would not accept this. No one would. We were infantry, not storytellers, not believers. As the light grew, the forest seemed to relax. The flames receded further, smoke thinning, birds cautiously testing the air with isolated calls. The shapes did not appear in daylight, and for a brief, dangerous moment, hope crept in. Some men whispered that it was over, that night had played tricks on us, that exhaustion and fear had conspired to create a shared hallucination. I wanted to believe that. Then we found the marks. At the edge of the ridge, in a patch of damp soil untouched by fire, were impressions pressed deep into the ground. They were not boots, not hooves, not paws. They were long and narrow, tapering at one end, as if made by something that did not lift its feet in the way living creatures do. They approached the ridge, stopped abruptly, and ended. There were no prints leading away, no sign of retreat or leap, just termination, as if the ground itself had decided that was as far as they needed to go. I stared at them until my eyes burned, understanding settling in like a weight. The forest had not been attacking us. It had been selecting. As the sergeant ordered us forward again, urging us out of the trees before night could return, I felt the certainty harden inside me like a shard of glass. We had not escaped because we were stronger or faster. We had been released. Behind us, the forest smoldered quietly, patient, its fires still burning where they chose to burn, and somewhere within that blackened maze, the shapes remained, waiting for the next war to give them reason to walk again. We thought dawn meant safety. We were wrong. The forest only waits for the moment you believe you've survived. Daylight never truly arrived. The sky lightened, yes, but the forest swallowed it, filtering what little brightness remained into a dull, lifeless gray. We pushed forward along the ridge, boots dragging, bodies running on something past exhaustion. Some men were bleeding without realizing it. Shallow cuts from branches and falls that had gone unnoticed in the night. No one complained. Pain meant you were still present. Stopping meant you might not be. The fires behind us had quieted, but they hadn't gone out. Thin columns of smoke rose between the trunks, drifting sideways instead of upward, stretching like fingers searching for purchase. The smell changed again. Less sharp, more earthy, as if the ground itself had been opened and was slowly breathing out. We descended from the ridge into a section of forest that had been spared the worst of the bombardment. Tall trees stood intact here, their canopies dense, blocking even the weak daylight. The temperature dropped sharply, cold enough that our breath showed. Though embers still glowed beneath fallen leaves, it felt wrong. Like walking between seasons that shouldn't exist at the same time. The sergeant ordered a staggered formation, wider spacing, clearer lines of sight. It was the right call militarily, and it made absolutely no difference. The forest did not care how we arranged ourselves. We hadn't gone far when the first tremor passed through the ground. It was subtle, just a low vibration underfoot, easy to mistake for distant artillery. None of us said anything. We didn't want to give it a name. The vibration came again, stronger this time, enough to make loose bark fall from the trees. Somewhere ahead, birds erupted from the canopy in a frantic cloud, then vanished, leaving the air heavier than before. That was when the forest began to move. At first it was the trees, or what I thought were trees. Trunks shifted positions slowly, not uprooting, not crashing, but sliding, as if the ground beneath them were fluid paths we just walked, narrowed or vanished entirely. Branches leaned inward, knitting together overhead, sealing off lines of retreat. The sergeant shouted for us to keep moving, to push through before panic took hold, but the terrain resisted, reshaping itself step by step. I felt like we were being guided, not chased, funneled, toward something waiting deeper inside. The fires returned abruptly, igniting in places that had been cold moments earlier. Flames ran along roots beneath the soil, surfacing ahead of us to block our path, forcing sudden turns. The heat rose in waves, then dropped again, Disorienting, nauseating, sweat froze on my back while my face burned. A man to my left screamed and fired wildly into the trees. The shots echoed, sharp and useless. He collapsed seconds later, clutching his leg. Though there was no wound, he swore something had grabbed him, pulled him down, then let go when we dragged him upright. His trousers were scorched in a pattern that looked deliberate, curved marks like fingers pressed into fabric. The sergeant ordered him to his feet and pushed us onward. There was no room for debate. We were beyond rules now. The shapes returned, not all at once, not dramatically. They appeared the way reflections do when you realize you've been staring at glass. Suddenly obvious, impossible to unsee. They stood between trees, behind burning brush, sometimes partially obscured by flame, sometimes outlined cleanly against it. They moved when the forest moved, advancing as paths closed, retreating when we hesitated. They were coordinating. The realization chilled me more than the cold. They weren't random manifestations or tricks of light. They were part of whatever system governed this place. The lieutenant broke again. He began shouting orders that contradicted one another, spinning in place, pointing down paths that no longer existed. The sergeant struck him hard across the face, knocking him to the ground and taking command without ceremony. No one objected. Authority belonged to whoever could still act. We followed the sergeant into a narrow corridor between two walls of fire, smoke clawing at our throats, eyes watering until the world blurred. As we passed through, I felt pressure on both sides, like walking between massive bodies pressed close, barely contained. The corridor opened suddenly into a clearing, and every instinct in my body screamed at once. The clearing was wrong. It was too symmetrical, too deliberate. A near-perfect circle ringed by scorched earth. At its center stood a mound of blackened soil, steaming faintly, as if something enormous had recently emerged or submerged again. The fire formed a boundary around it, a living wall that pulsed and shifted but never crossed inward. The shapes stood along that boundary, evenly spaced, watching. They did not block us. They waited. The sergeant ordered us around the edge, skirting the circle, as quickly as possible. The moment we stepped onto the clearing's perimeter, the ground vibrated violently, knocking several men off their feet. A deep sound rolled up from beneath us. Not a roar, not a voice, but a resonance that rattled teeth and made my vision swim. The mound at the center shifted slightly, soil sliding down its sides. One man lost control and ran straight across the clearing, screaming that he wasn't going to die there. He made it halfway before the fire surged inward, not burning him, but wrapping around his body like cloth. His scream cut off abruptly. He was gone. When the flames receded, there was nothing left. Not ash, not bone, not even a mark where he'd been. The sergeant shouted for us to move, and we did, stumbling, scrambling, every step fueled by pure survival. The shapes watched without intervening, their silhouettes steady, patient. The forest shook again, harder this time, and the trees beyond the clearing began to sway, not with wind, but in unison, bending toward us, closing distance. We burst from the far side of the clearing into dense undergrowth, tearing through brush, ignoring cuts and falls. The fire followed, flaring behind us, hurting us onward. I stopped thinking in words. My world narrowed to breath, foot placement, keeping the man in front of me within reach. The forest felt alive now in a way I could no longer deny. Not metaphorically, not poetically, but mechanically, like a system executing a function we had triggered. The vibration faded gradually as we put distance between ourselves and the clearing. The fire thinned again, retreating to isolated pockets. The shapes stopped appearing openly, though their presence lingered like a weight pressing down on the back of my neck. Eventually, the sergeant called a halt. We collapsed where we stood, some sitting, some lying flat on the damp ground, chests heaving. The count was catastrophic. We were no longer a unit, we were fragments. The lieutenant sat apart again, silent, eyes empty, his rank meaningless now. No one spoke about the clearing, no one needed to. The memory of it clung to us, sharp and raw. As dusk approached for the second time, a terrible understanding settled over me. The forest had not attacked us in chaos. It had tested, guided, culled. It had used fire not as a weapon, but as a tool. The war had wounded the land, torn it open, poured blood into its roots, and something beneath had woken up, something that understood conflict better than we ever could. When night began to fall again, the sergeant ordered us forward without rest. We didn't argue. We knew better now. darkness wasn't the danger, belief was. The moment you thought you understood what was happening, the forest changed the rules, and as we moved deeper into the trees once more, I knew with grim certainty that the night was not over. The forest had walked, and it was not finished choosing. The most frightening part was not what we saw that night, but how quickly the world decided it hadn't happened at all. Sometime before dawn, the forest released us, not abruptly, not mercifully. That it simply loosened its grip. The way a hand opens after deciding it no longer needs to hold. That I realized it only when the ground stopped shifting beneath my feet and the air began to behave like air again. Cold, yes, and heavy with smoke, but no longer watching us. The fires dwindled into scattered embers, glowing faintly among fallen leaves, and the trees resumed their silence, tall and indifferent, as if they had never moved. At all. We stumbled out of the tree line into a stretch of open ground churned by old shell craters and abandoned vehicles, the remnants of a retreat that had passed through weeks earlier. The sky above was pale and exhausted, washed out blue smeared with smoke, and no one cheered and no one spoke. We simply stood there, blinking, waiting for something else to happen. The sergeant ordered a final count. The number felt unreal when he said it aloud. That we had entered the forest as a reinforced platoon. We emerged as barely more than a squad. There were men whose names I still carried in my head, voices, habits, faces, that no longer had bodies attached to them, and no dog tags, and no graves, and no record of where they'd gone. The lieutenant tried to speak, tried to regain some measure of command, but his words fell apart as they left his mouth. That he stopped halfway through a sentence, and stared past us, eyes unfocused, as if still seeing fire between the trees. The sergeant took over again, assigning watches, checking weapons, forcing us to drink from canteens we didn't remember refilling. That we obeyed automatically. The habit of discipline was the last thing holding us together. Morning light revealed details the night had hidden. The ground near the forest edge was marked with strange patterns. Scorched arcs, spirals burned into the soil, trees blackened on one side but untouched on the other. Some trunks bore deep grooves, parallel marks cut clean through bark and into wood, too precise to be shrapnel, too deliberate to be chance, and no one commented on them. When one of the younger soldiers started to ask a question, the sergeant shut him down with a look alone. We all understood instinctively that acknowledging those marks gave them weight. The less we said, the easier it would be to pretend we didn't see. Hours later, we made contact with a rear echelon unit. They looked at us like ghosts. Filthy, hollow-eyed, missing equipment and men. When asked what happened in the forest, the lieutenant opened his mouth, closed it again, and glanced at the sergeant. The sergeant answered for him. Artillery confusion. Enemy harassment. Loss of cohesion during retreat. All phrases that fit neatly into reports. All lies, but useful ones. No one pushed for details. They were too busy moving their own units, too busy surviving their own collapses. We were processed quickly. Names taken, ammunition redistributed, orders issued to move further west. By nightfall, we were attached to another formation, our original designation effectively dissolved. The forest burned behind us for another day, then went quiet from a distance. It looked ordinary again. Smoke rising lazily, fire dying in patches, no sign of the shapes or the movement or the impossible geometry that had swallowed us. But those of us who'd been inside knew better. We felt it in our bodies. The way sleep refused to come without jolting nightmares. The way sudden heat or sudden cold made us flinch. The way shadows pooled too deeply at the edges of vision. That night, I overheard officers speaking in low tones. They had reports, they said. Not just ours. Similar incidents along other retreat routes. Forests behaving strangely. Units suffering unexplained losses. Disappearances with no engagement records. The explanation was always the same: confusion, fatigue, panic under pressure. The war produced plenty of those. No one wanted a different answer. A different answer would mean admitting the war had awakened something it could not command. Within days, orders came down forbidding discussion of specific engagements during the retreat. Any mention of unusual phenomena was to be attributed to stress or enemy deception. Medical officers circulated quietly, evaluating men who talked too much, writing notes about combat fatigue and recommending reassignment. I learned quickly to keep my mouth shut. Klaus didn't. He muttered to himself constantly, warnings and fragments of stories spilling out when he thought no one listened. One morning, he was gone. Transferred, they said. No destination listed. No goodbye. I never saw him again. The war ended not long after, at least officially. ceasefires were signed. Flags changed, handshakes were photographed. The machinery of history rolled forward, grinding down the chaos into clean narratives of victory and defeat. I went home thinner, older, carrying scars that didn't show on my skin. When people asked what it had been like, I gave them the stories they expected: mud, hunger, fear of shells. They nodded, satisfied, and no one asked about the forest. They didn't want that kind of truth. Years passed, the world rebuilt itself over ruins, and memory softened at the edges. But some nights I still smelled smoke where there was none. Still woke with my heart racing, convinced the walls of my room were leaning inward that I followed news when I could. Small articles buried in back pages. Fires behaving strangely in remote regions. Soldiers reporting unexplained losses during conflicts far from home. The language was always the same as it had been in 1945. Coincidence. Exhaustion. Nothing to see. Here. I understood then what the forest had taught you is that IT didn't need recognition, that IT didn't need belief. All it needed was violence, scale, and fire. War provided those things in abundance. The land absorbed them, stored them, and something beneath responded. Not out of malice. Not out of hunger. But out of function, the way storms respond to pressure changes. The forest hadn't been angry, IT had been active. As I grew older, the memories didn't fade the way others did. They sharpened. I could still see the unburned tree in the clearing, feel the pressure in my chest as the shapes closed in, hear the silence snap shut around us. The official records listed our losses as unfortunate but unremarkable, a footnote in a collapsing front. For the world, the forest was just another battlefield crossed and forgotten. For me, it became a dividing line. There was the world before it, where war was terrible but understandable. And the world after, where I knew that conflict leaves residues, imprints that linger waiting for the next spark. When people speak of haunted places, they imagine spirits trapped in the past, replaying old pain that I know better. Some places are not haunted. They are alert. They watch. They learn. And when enough blood soaks into the soil, when enough fire tears through root and stone, they respond. Not as monsters, not as gods, but as something older than both, as something the war did not create, only invited. And even now, when I hear of forests burning in distant lands, of soldiers vanishing without explanation, I feel the same cold certainty settle in my chest. The flames may go quiet, but what wakes beneath them never truly sleeps. They didn't silence us with threats. They silenced us by teaching us how easy it was to disappear. After the war officially ended, the surviving fragments of our unit were scattered with deliberate efficiency, and 2 of us were sent to the same place for long. Assignments changed without explanation. Paperwork vanished or reappeared altered, dates shifted, locations renamed. The retreat through the forest was reduced to a smudge on a map, a logistical inconvenience buried under larger movements of men and armor. I understood then that forgetting was not accidental. It was policy. My first posting after demobilization was administrative, a quiet job meant to keep hands busy and mouths shut. I filed reports from the final months of the war, reading sanitized versions of events I had lived through. The language was bloodless and precise. Losses sustained during withdrawal, terrain complications, communication failure due to environmental conditions. There was no room in those pages for shadows that bent fire or ground that rearranged itself. No space for men taken without wounds. When I tried once to add a note, just a sentence questioning discrepancies in personnel numbers, it came back stamped and redacted, the ink so thick it tore the paper. Others learned faster than I did. One man drank himself into silence. Another began to claim he remembered nothing at all, not even the retreat, not even the names of the missing. Doctors praised that kind of forgetting. They called it recovery. Klaus's absence lingered in my mind. I asked about him once, casually, during a transfer. A clerk checked a ledger, frowned, and said there was no record of a soldier by that name attached to my unit at any point. The lie was effortless. That frightened me more than the forest ever had. Years passed, people married, rebuilt, tried to pretend the world made sense again. I did my best to follow suit. But the past refused to stay buried. Small things brought it back. The smell of damp earth after rain, the way firelight flickered on walls, the sensation of being guided through a crowd without touching anyone. I began collecting stories quietly, not out of obsession, but out of necessity. When veterans spoke after a few drinks, when refugees whispered rumors, When old men muttered half-forgotten warnings, I listened. The patterns were unmistakable. Forests during retreats, deserts during bombardments, swamps churned by artillery, fires that behaved wrong, units thinned without contact, men erased from records as if they had never been born. No one described the same thing exactly. The forms changed, the shapes differed, but the structure remained. There was always a boundary. There was always a selection. There was always an unspoken agreement afterward to let the story die. That I learned to recognize that agreement in the way conversations ended abruptly, in the way eyes slid away when certain details surfaced. It wasn't fear of ridicule. It was fear of being noticed again. Once, years later, I met a man who had served in a different army on a different front. He had been part of a reconnaissance patrol moving through a burned woodland late in the war. When I mentioned fire and silence in the same sentence, his hand tightened around his glass. He didn't ask questions. He didn't interrupt. He simply listened. When I finished, he nodded once and said, "Ours didn't like the cold." Then he stood up and left without another word. That single sentence confirmed everything. Official histories continued to be written. Monuments were raised, cemeteries filled with names that could be carved in stone. The others, the ones without bodies, without witnesses willing to speak, were absorbed into statistics. I sometimes visited archives, reading declassified files as they trickled out decades later. There were gaps everywhere, pages missing, sections marked destroyed, references to incidents cross-linked to files that no longer existed. It was as if someone had taken a blade to the historical record and cut out anything that hinted at a deeper pattern. The strangest part was that the effort wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. Truth, I learned, doesn't vanish. It diffuses. It seeps into folklore, into superstition, into the kinds of stories people tell children to keep them from wandering too far into the woods or lighting fires where they shouldn't. Local legends began to shift in the years after the war. New details appeared in old myths. Guardians that once punished trespassers were now said to wake only during times of great violence. Shadows that fed on chaos. Fire spirits that moved against the wind. Historians dismissed these changes as post-war imagination, communities trying to make sense of trauma. They weren't wrong, but they weren't right either. I stopped trying to correct anyone. The forest had taught me something fundamental. Understanding was not protection, attention was risk. Those of us who survived had not been spared out of mercy. We had been released with conditions: forget and live. Write it down, speak too clearly, and invite notice again. That knowledge shaped every choice I made afterward, every silence I kept, every story I let trail off before reaching its conclusion. As decades passed, the world found new wars, new fires. I watched from a distance as reports repeated themselves with uncanny familiarity. Unexplained losses during wildfires near conflict zones. Units rerouted without explanation. Survivors diagnosed with stress disorders that didn't quite fit. The language never changed, only the dates and names. The pattern held. I understood then that what we encountered in 1945 was not bound to one nation or one conflict. It followed conditions. Not flags. It emerged where land was broken on a scale too large for human memory to process, where violence saturated soil and flames stripped away restraint. The war hadn't created it. It had announced itself to it, loudly, persistently, with every shell and every order to burn. Now, as I set these words down at last, I do so knowing the risk is smaller than it once was. Not gone. Smaller, time dulls attention. The world is louder now, distracted by endless noise. But I also know that forgetting entirely is dangerous in its own way. Legends exist to carry truths that history refuses to hold. They are warnings disguised as stories. We were told to forget because remembering would change how wars are understood. It would mean admitting that conflict does not end at the edge of human intention, that it awakens forces indifferent to cause or justification. It would mean accepting that some losses cannot be reclaimed, not because they are hidden, but because they were never meant to return. I have lived a long life by staying quiet, but silence is not the same as peace. The forest remains with me, not as fear, but as knowledge, and knowledge, once carried long enough, demands to be passed on, even if only as a whisper, even if only as legend. Some stories end when the fighting stops. This one only began to make sense after everything else went quiet. I am an old man now. The war has been over longer than it lasted, and most of the people who could contradict me are gone. buried, burned, or reduced to footnotes no one reads. The world prefers clean endings. Ceasefires, signatures, photographs of ruined cities rebuilding themselves as proof that damage can be reversed. But there are endings that do not announce themselves, that do not conclude so much as settle, sinking into the land and into memory until they become part of the background. I understand now that what happened in that forest was never meant to be solved. It was meant to be remembered differently. For years, I told myself the night would fade with time, that age would soften its edges, turn it into just another story warped by distance. But the opposite happened. The details sharpened, aligning themselves with things I learned later, patterns I noticed too often to dismiss. When people spoke of haunted places, of cursed ground, I listened for what they left out. They always talked about the dead, about spirits trapped by unfinished business. They never spoke about systems, about responses, about land behaving the way bodies do when pushed too far. The forest taught me that violence accumulates. It does not disperse evenly. It pools. It saturates. It changes the rules of the place where it happens. When we burned our way through that woodland in 1945, we believed we were denying cover, removing obstacles, forcing an enemy into the open. What we actually did was announce ourselves to something that had no allegiance and no need to understand our reasons. We mistook silence for absence. We mistook fire for control. We were wrong. I returned once, decades later, not out of bravery, not curiosity, but because I needed to know whether the place remembered me. I didn't wear a uniform. I didn't bring weapons. The forest looked ordinary enough. New growth where old trees had fallen, trails worn by hikers instead of soldiers, birds sang. The air smelled clean. But beneath that surface normality, the ground felt heavy, dense with layers of past events compressed together. I stood at the edge and felt the same pressure in my chest I had felt that night, faint but unmistakable, like the echo of a hand closing around something it had once held that I did not enter. I did not need to. The message was clear. Some boundaries remain even when no one marks them. Over time, I came to see how the story changed as it passed from mouth to mouth. In villages near former battlefields, people warned children not to wander during fires. Not because of smoke or falling trees, but because the dark walks when the land burns. In other places, hunters spoke of shadows that kept pace with them just beyond torchlight, never attacking, never retreating, until the men turned back on their own. These weren't inventions. They were translations. Folklore doing what it has always done, carrying instructions where official language fails. The meaning revealed itself slowly, the way truths do when they are too large to absorb all at once. The forest had not been evil. It had not been righteous. It had been responsive. It reacted to scale, to intensity, to the density of destruction pressed into a single place. The war created the conditions. Fire opened pathways. Blood marked routes. Movement gave shape. What emerged was not a monster, but a function, an old one, refined long before uniforms and borders existed. We had stepped into it, without knowing the cost. That understanding changed how I saw conflict afterward. I stopped believing wars end when treaties are signed. They end when the land finishes processing what it has been given. Some places heal. Some don't. Some remember in ways that do not align with human timelines or forgiveness. We build memorials for ourselves, but the ground keeps its own record, written in patterns we only notice when they begin to move. I think often of the men who vanished without bodies or graves. The official histories say they were lost in confusion, victims of chaos. That explanation comforts people. It keeps loss manageable. But I believe now that they became part of the warning. Their absence was not erasure. It was inscription. They marked a threshold, a point beyond which violence stops being a human argument and becomes an environmental one. They were not punished. They were taken out of circulation, removed from a process that no longer needed them. If that sounds cold, it is. Because the truth is not obligated to be gentle. Legends soften it because people need softness to carry heavy things. But beneath the myth, the instruction remains clear. Destruction on a massive enough scale does not stay contained. It provokes responses older than strategy, older than politics. When land is forced to absorb too much too quickly, it adapts. And those adaptations are not concerned with justice or blame. This is why the story persists, even when no one names it outright. Why it appears in different uniforms, different languages, different terrains. Forests, deserts, mountains, swamps. Wherever fire and violence overlap long enough to strip away restraint, the same pattern emerges: silence, shape, selection. Afterward, forgetting. Not because forgetting is required, but because remembering demands a change in behavior most societies are unwilling to make. I did not survive because I was clever or strong. I survived because I learned, too late but not too late, that resistance was not the point. The forest released us when it had finished its work. That realization stripped away the last illusions I had about control. War teaches you many false lessons about dominance, about force as solution. The forest corrected those lessons brutally and efficiently. Now, at the end of my life, I understand my role was never to expose secrets or demand belief. That it was to add one more layer to the story, one more voice folded into the warning. Legends do not ask to be proven. They ask to be heeded. They exist so that when conditions begin to align again, when fires spread unnaturally, when silence deepens instead of breaking, someone, somewhere, hesitates. That hesitation matters. It creates space. It prevents repetition. If there is a moral to what I witnessed, it is not that the world is haunted. It is that the world responds. We are not alone in shaping outcomes. We share this ground with processes far older than us, and they do not distinguish between enemies and allies. They recognize only pressure, only imbalance. When we push too hard, something pushes back, not out of anger, but necessity. I remember the night the forest burned and the shadow came, not as a nightmare, but as an education. It taught me that history does not belong solely to those who write it. It belongs to the land that endures it. And the land, unlike us, does not forget. That is why this story survives, not as testimony, not as report, but as legend. Because legends are how warnings travel when truth is too heavy to carry directly. And if someday, in another war, another soldier feels the fire bend the wrong way and the silence close too tightly, maybe this memory, passed quietly, imperfectly, will reach them in time to stop, to turn back, to let the ground rest. Some stories are meant to scare. Some are meant to explain. This one exists to remind you that war leaves marks deeper than ruins, and that not all of them stay still. This story is inspired by documented wartime reports, blended with folklore, and dramatized for narrative purposes.